Hi everyone, today I present my class tier list for Season 1 of Diablo 4. You might remember my old launch class tier list video that had pretty much a similar style. I ranked all of the classes by various categories overall, so I'm not like ranking specific builds here necessarily, but I do include some mentions here, for example, like certain of the meta builds or certain, for example, push builds, certain speed farming builds that certain classes have. And I just want to give my overall impressions of the state of the game, of the state of balance between classes, so that it may help you choose what to play in the upcoming season. So we have the different categories here: early game leveling, endgame progression, build diversity, endgame nightmare dungeon push, endgame speed farming, pinnacle bosses, ease to play, group utility, hardcore, and a special section for the season theme with Malignant Hearts. Now, especially the last part here is obviously quite speculative because we have not seen them in action yet. We don't know most of the mechanics, and there might be some things that either is busted or doesn't work properly and these kind of things. So this is with a grain of salt, but for the most part, I think I have a pretty good understanding of where each of the classes land in general. Having played a lot of the Diablo 4 endgame now, and obviously just being connected, talking to people, looking at what other classes are capable of, I'm trying to kind of keep a good overview here in general, especially because we're also making those tier lists here on Maxroll where we have regular meetings and we discuss where exactly each of those builds land, for example, for those various activities. And I try to put this together into like one consolidated list. So let's start here with the early game leveling. I think that the best leveling class by far is the Rogue. I think this comes as no surprise. Rogue is just fast from the start. Rogue just works from the start. And it's generally a really powerful class. As you can see, it has a lot of these S's. And I ranked it as the number 2 overall. And Rogue also has a lot of different options available for leveling. So that's really great. Basically everything you want to play on Rogue is just good. Then we have the Sorc. Sorc is not looking good at all in this patch. I'm gonna go into it in a second, but the patch notes really gutted the Sorc, but it doesn't really affect the early game, so at least that is good. Then you have Necros, kind of like middle of the pack, and Druids are relatively bad at leveling, but it gets a bit better once you get the companions. And then you have Barbs that are just like 2 gear dependent, that is definitely feel like the worst in my opinion in the early game. So when we're talking about 1 to 50, no aspects, etc., it's not really that great. But it depends a little bit on the build as well. What is more relevant for most people is probably the endgame progression, which is just general gameplay, general leveling from 50 to 100. So this is the category that we're ranking here. And well, again, the Rogue is just really good. Like Rogue just kind of like starts at a high level and ends at a high level. It kind of has a very smooth progression curve. It's not like a Barb where early game is really terrible and then later it just starts blasting really hard. So that's kind of how that works. Kind of similar for the Druids as well. They start really slow and they just become extremely good later on and actually just like surpass, for example, the Rogues. So Rogue is just like a much more like evened out basically. And then, something like Druid goes like way further basically. So kind of like that. Then Necro kind of stays in the middle of the pack. So main issue is that they're relatively slow compared to other classes, no mobility skills, etc. And then we have Sorcs. So Sorcs, if you have seen the patch notes, they got kind of obliterated with Aspect of Control and Devouring Blaze being really nerfed, and there's not really much to compensate for that. Now, ranking them as F might be a bit of an exaggeration here, but at the very least it captures the sentiment that most people have with the Sorcerer right now. That being said, I am relatively excited for some stuff on Sorcerer. Like, I definitely want to try some Frozen Orb build myself. I want to try some Charged Bolts build myself and just see how it goes. And in general, there's definitely a lot of things to experiment with, especially with the hearts, but it comes later. I just think that the main issue here with Sorcs is that they are just probably the weakest class in terms of DPS, and they're probably also weakest class in terms of defense. So this is why they get an F. They're probably just not gonna feel great. Now that being said, Sorc definitely has some viable endgame stuff, especially when it comes to speed farming, as you can see here. Then we have build diversity, so I ranked Druid and Rogues here the best. I think in general, in terms of like the most amount of decent builds or good builds. Rogue is probably the best because they're also all extremely balanced. So for like general gameplay, see here we have like 3 times S for Rogue and then 3 times A for Rogue, and then that's basically covers everything. Everything on Rogue is just good, no matter what you want to play. That is really cool, and that's kind of like where the other classes should land eventually, hopefully. So let's hope. But for the Druids, we have also a bunch of good builds. There's Tornado, Lightning Storm, Polarize, Shred. Lots of good stuff. There's even like the bugged builds like Bulwark, but that's mostly like Nightmare Dungeon pushing build only. But there are some more options, and there's also some kind of quirky stuff like Boulder can do or so that are not necessarily top tier, but you could probably try. So generally, Druids definitely have a lot of different builds, and a lot of them are good. Then we have Barb and Necro. I rank them kind of in the middle here with B each, where, yeah, Barb has a bunch of stuff like this Hoda, Whirlwind, Double Swing. You can kind of play all these kind of things. There's a Kratos build, there's the Rend. Generally, though, a lot of this has this kind of triple shout combo. We'll see if maybe the cooldown nerfs kind of break up that meta a bit now. But for the most part, this is how most of the builds seem to work, with the exception of the Kratos and the Double Swing, I guess. So most of these Barb builds kind of feel the same. And the same also applies to the Sorcs here, with most of them having like the same 3 or 4 defensive skills with Ice Armor, Flame Shield, Teleport, and Frost Nova. It's basically always the same. And then there are different flavors of like core and mastery skills to actually deal damage, but also most of them are not exactly powerful right now. And the Necro here has a bunch of decent builds, has a bunch of like mediocre builds. They're gonna be just fine, I guess. Next up, the Nightmare Dungeon pushing on the high end. So this means very high tiers like 80 plus, 90, 100, etc. So for like going towards the absolute maximum, I think the best class for that is the Druid. Druid is just extremely powerful, extremely tanky, has good builds for that. Basically the same stuff we already mentioned here. Especially Tornado is very good, the Bulwark build, but that might get nuked like any second because it's a bug, so who knows. Then we have the Rogue. Rogue has a bunch of relatively powerful builds, not as powerful as the Druid, but you have the advantage you can actually kind of survive. You can build a Rogue very tanky if you need to. You have a lot of crowd controls, so you can kind of like make your way through those dungeons, and you have ranged skills that actually do something. So Rapid Fire, Pen Shot, Twisting Blades, those are the favorites here. Then we have Barb. Barb gets an A from me. I think Barb is still going to be just fine when it comes to Nightmare Dungeon pushing, mostly because of the insane defenses they have. Even with like the post-nerf defenses, being a melee class is not really a death sentence in those high tiers, so I think it will be okay. And some of those builds were mostly unchanged, like Double Swing, that was already quite powerful. Then we have the Necro. Necro also has decently powerful builds for pushing, I'd say. Bone Spear, Infernalist, Bloodlance, maybe some stuff with the new Littlest Vault unique, but they are just extremely squishy. It's extremely hard to actually get through a dungeon without dying, so I think this is kind of like what holds them back. And then we have the Sorcs. They are, yeah, all glass, no cannon, basically. So this is what it looks like for those. Not really sure what to expect there. On the bright side though, for endgame speed farming, Sorcs actually kind of like pick up. So when we're talking about farming just very easy content, you know, like low Nightmare Dungeons, farming outdoor content, farming Helltide, these kind of things. Once they have a really optimized endgame character at level 100, Sorcs will probably feel pretty decent again, even with the cooldown nerfs. So generally they were like the class that scales by far the most of cooldown. So those cooldown nerfs have hit Sorc the hardest, I guess. Maybe Barbs as well with the shouts. But for the most part, it will be okay, I guess, once you have everything together. Teleport is amazing. And if the damage doesn't matter all that much when you have easy content, then Sorcs are actually pretty good. Not as good as the Druid and the Rogue. So Rogue just stays fast and, you know, just get in all the movement speed. You teleport around with Dash and Shadow Step and just blow everything up. So that just works. And the Druid, yeah, you have some really fast builds. In fact, the Druid has probably the fastest build in the game, which is Shred. And a bunch of other decent builds like Tornado, Lightning Storm, etc. that are also pretty fast, the high movement speed, etc. Kind of the same candidates here. So Druid has like, yeah, the best farming build probably, and the best pushing build, or two even, in the game. So that's also part of the reason why they have the #1 spot here. And we have the barbs, yeah, just generally pretty good, especially with good gear, especially with lots of cooldown, perma shouts, or close to it, etc. That's gonna feel pretty good. And the necros, you kind of suffer from the same issue as before, no movement skills. You can rely on just like stacking movement speed from your items, and maybe something like movement speed on elite kill and these kind of things. Yeah, and then you have mechanics that just have this delayed damage over time, or you have minions that, you know, first need to aggro and attack and do their thing. So it's just not as fast as the other classes. Then we have the Pinnacle Bosses. So we have two really good classes here, the Druid and the Rogue yet again. For the Druid, it's mostly based on the bugged Blurred Beast, where you can kind of like just one-shot Uber Lilith. So that is also a build that will get nuked any second. If that is the case, then I would say it's like a B or so. You can do it with Tornado, it's kind of fine. Still relatively tough though. Then there's the Rogue that also have a bugged build with Bursting Venoms that has also not been fixed. So that just does way more damage than it should. People have been using that with Twisting Blades to just like decimate Uber Lilith as well, for example. If that is fixed, Rogue is still pretty good though. So I'll probably still rank Rogue as or a even post bug fix. I have done it personally with Rapid Fire. Twisting Blades is a bit better than Rapid Fire. Both of these are some really good options in general for like Uber Lilith. And so Rogues are just like really good against that fight in particular. Then we have Necro. Necros have Bone Spear and then Blood Mist, so it's kind of easy to do those fights, and you have the high damage output to just kind of like ignore most mechanics. And then we have Barbs that just like have relatively low sustained DPS in this fight, but you can be very tanky. You can actually, you know, not die to some one-shot mechanics. So that helps a bit with like doing those fights. And we have the Sorc that can do the Blizzard stuff with Stagger. That kind of works, or Ice Shards maybe. You have Flame Shield to avoid some mechanics, but overall probably the worst here. For the easy to play category, I think that Druids are definitely the winner here. I think Druids just have like relatively straightforward builds most of the time. You press Polarize, everything dies. You press Tornado, everything dies. You know, it kind of works. You're tanky. It's nice. Then we have like three classes kind of like on the same, I think, where, yeah, you always met. So this is the Barb, the Necro, and the Rogue. So they each have their own like advantages and difficulties. Previously, I had ranked the Rogue much lower here because they're like, you know, fast, agile. You have to rely on crowd controls, not really that tanky, etc. But it turns out with just how powerful Rogues are in general right now, I think they're going to be, you know, just fine in terms of like how it is to maneuver them. And yeah, Necros are just like pretty straightforward. Barbs are pretty straightforward. The main difficulty is being tanky enough and being in melee range and actually dodging attacks and these kind of things. And lastly, the Sorc. I don't think that Sorcs have like these crazy like mechanics in terms of like how you have to play your character right now. But since they are relatively weak and really squishy, I give them a D. I just expect that if you're playing a Sorcerer, it's just going to be like noticeably harder in general in anything you do compared to the other classes. So that's why it's down there. Then we have the group utility. So this is if you want to play with friends or if you want to try to actually make like a full support character. In fact, for example, we do have a support Druid guide now on Maxroll. So if you want to check that out, it is actually relatively powerful. But I think that Druids in general are just like really good for party play. So you have lots of buffs, damage reduction, everything you can bring for your party, vulnerable uptime. You can tank stuff. So it's just really nice. We have Barbs as well with the shouts in particular. Again, very tanky. You can pull enemies with the Steel Grasp. That also has a bunch of group utility that you can just like also throw in, or it's just passively present in some of those builds. A lot of builds on Barb just have a lot of shouts. And that obviously affects your party members and helps them out as well. Then we have the Necro, who brings a bunch of decent like buffs like Decrepify, lots of vulnerable, corpse tendrils for the pull. So there is some stuff like that that helps out here. And then we have Rogue and Sorc that kind of have some group viability, but that depends a bit on the combo sometimes. For example, you have Cold Imbue, you can freeze enemies, and there may be other rogues present that can benefit from that. For like extra damage, for example, or maybe there might be a Sorc with Ice Shards and suddenly those start proccing those Ice Shards from the freeze of the Rogue. So those things are possible. So it depends a little bit on like what you're combining it with. you don't really have that many like crazy buffs. It's mostly just CCs for those two classes here. For the hardcore ranking, this has actually changed quite a lot. So I originally had Sorc really high up here. That was actually S, I believe, mostly because of the Flame Shield enchant, but it was also before we actually understood the Elixir of Death Evasion, which is basically that thing. So that kind of removes the reason to run Flame Shield and removes the main advantage of Sorcerer in hardcore. And again, Sorcerer is going to be very squishy in this minus 750 armor season. And I expect them to kind of suffer when it comes to hardcore. Let's see how that goes. On the other extreme, we have Druid yet again. Druid just being tanky, being relatively powerful overall. Same with the Barbs. They're kind of fine, especially once you get out the early game. They are really tanky, so it feels good to play hardcore on those. And then we have kind of like in between the Rogues and the Necros. Rogues are okay. You can build a lot of defenses there, as I mentioned with the Nightmare Dungeon push. There's a lot of stuff you can include to kind of survive. Rogues have actually surprised me a little bit by how much defenses I can put into those builds. But on the other hand, it's not like as crazy as on these two classes. And you have the Necros that, yeah, depends a bit on the build. You have Decrepify, you have Fortify, but you are slow. You only have this kind of like long cooldown Blood Mist to save you. You don't have like any mobility skills to get out of danger. So yeah, they're kind of weak there. And lastly, we have the Malignant Hearts. So if you want to read up on those, we have the full post here with all 32 Malignant Hearts. There are 4 class-specific ones each, and then 12 generic ones. So these can be used by anyone, and they kind of provide a bit of a baseline of extra power you gain from those hearts. And then, yeah, some of those class-specific ones are either extremely niche or kind of meme or just not really good. So there's a lot of problems here, I would say. But in general, those hearts will be a noticeable boost in power compared to Eternal Realm, I feel. So that applies especially to the Necros. They seem to have like just all around really good stuff there with like auto triggering corpses and these kind of things, for example. So that sounds really good. Then we have the Rogues that have kind of okay stuff, and the Barbs as well. Rogues in particular is the Vile Apothecary that gives you a chance to apply imbuements to all of your attacks. That is kind of cool. And then we have Sorc. They have Omni Power. This one definitely seems to have a lot of potential to make some of the underperforming Sorc builds really great, as long as they can figure out how to get enough mana. But this may even apply to Chain Lightning. This will apply to like Fireballs, Frozen Orb hopefully as well. This is like part of the reason why I'm really excited to play Frozen Orb, because I want to play around this thing and then just like throw them everywhere. So that's going to be pretty cool, I believe. And lastly, you have the Druid here. So they seem kind of bad on the Druid, to be fair. There's like this Wolf Companion kind of meme thing. Then there is the Cyclone Armor, and even more of a meme, I feel. And then you have this one. That's going to be very interesting. Yeah, the Unconstrained Beast is probably the big one here, where we just got a fresh Grizzly Rage nerf. We don't have Perma Unstoppable anymore. Well, and now you can kind of get it back. And that concludes my tier list here. If you want to check out a few more details, you can also look at our max roll tier list. For example, we have the endgame tier list here. We have leveling tier lists, the Nightmare Dungeon push, the speed farming, etc. We also have some fancy stuff like the Nightmare Dungeons here, even the uniques. So take a look there if you want to see, for example, in the individual builds ranked. If you're like curious about, this or that build, then this is where to look. I try to give like a general overview here of how I feel about the classes, what is the state of things basically, and maybe also where the devs can take a look in the future. That's it. I wish you good luck in the season, and see you guys next time.